My name's Nigel Saul and I teach English Medieval History in the University of London, and I'm a member of the Magna Carta 800 Committee, which is coordinating the anniversary celebrations for the 800th of Magna Carta.
My name's Jonathan Phillips and I teach Medieval European History at Royal Holloway, University of London. We're here at Runnymede, 25 miles from central London. We're on the banks of the River Thames, and close by us we've got Heathrow Airport in the background. We've got cars, trains, planes, trains and automobiles, things that weren't around in the early 13th century. And I suppose when we set the scene for the events of Magna Carta, it's perhaps worthwhile thinking what was different about life then. And by mention of the Thames, I guess we have a medieval motorway.
Yes.
Medieval communications was very different to the modern time, very much slower, very much more localised society in many senses. One of the best ways of getting around was by river.
Yes, that's right. England in the beginning of the 13th century was a country in many ways totally different from ours today, but there were also some similarities. I suppose the biggest difference was that it was much less crowded. What's England's population today? About 60 million, I think. Population of England at the beginning of the 13th century in King John's reign was about 3 to 4 millions. And of course it was a predominantly rural population. The towns and cities were fewer and individually very much smaller.
So Nigel, how big was medieval London?
London's population today is about 8 or 9 millions. London's population at the beginning of the 13th century was about 40 to 50,000 at most.
That's an amazing difference, isn't it? 40, 50,000, what's that, sort of a small sports stadium? You meant the whole population of London inside a small sports stadium. Really does bring out the contrast.
Small sports stadium, or think of it in terms of they were all packed in to the 1 square mile of the city today. And Westminster, down the road, the seat of government, was completely separate, not absorbed in a big conurbation as it is today.
So most of the population lives in the countryside then?
It was basically a rural society, and the fruits of wealth were the fruits of the soil. So we have to picture a country peppered with villages, surrounded by the 3 big open fields, tilled by the peasantry. A small proportion of that peasantry were free, but most of them were unfree. In the terminology of the day, they were known as villeins. They were not slaves, no, definitely not slaves, but they were tied to the land and they toiled on the land, producing a surplus, most of which was handed over to the aristocracy, the great landowners, princes of church and state, and they were the people who ruled England.
When we think of the medieval world, I suppose we imagine the great buildings, castles, cathedrals, some of which are still with us today.
And we have one of the grandest of all Europe's royal castles, just a few miles up the road from us, at Windsor, one of the most important of the king's castles. And that's a castle that's one of the biggest in Europe. In London, the king also had the Tower of London, still there today, an intact medieval castle. So the king and the barons, yes, they lived in palatial scale castles. The knights, the country gentry, lived in manor houses. And as you say, this was the age when our great medieval cathedrals were built. Just after Magna Carta was agreed, one of the greatest of all was started in 1220, Salisbury Cathedral, built in 38 years between 1220 and 1258. Around here where we're standing today, the great church landowner was Chertsey Abbey. All the land around here belonged to Chertsey Abbey, one of the great abbeys of medieval England. But does anything survive of it today? No. It was swept away by Henry VIII at the Reformation.
And talking of abbeys and cathedrals reminds us of the centrality of religion to medieval life. And that's something that obviously stretched across Europe rather than having a national boundary.
So
Well, could you
Nigel,
tell me
how does England
compares
compare to Europe at this time?
England was in one sense economically less developed than other parts of continental Europe. It was less industrial. The industrial heartlands of medieval Europe were Flanders and northern Italy. That was where the cloth industry flourished. England had a cloth industry, but on a much smaller scale. So England was less industrialised. But what England did have was millions of sheep. Far more sheep in medieval England than there were people. And it was the clips, the wool clips from the sheep, exported to Flanders, that provided the raw materials for the Flemish cloth industry. And the export of wool made England rich. Wool then was like oil today. We had it, they wanted it. So on the strength of the profits of the wool trade, England was actually, by the standards of the day, quite a rich country. And that is one respect in which I think I would say England then was similar to England today. It was a wealthy country, and it was governed by a powerful monarchy. And you need to understand those two things to understand the background to the making of Magna Carta. It was the product of a relatively advanced society, a relatively wealthy society by the standards of the day, and a society in which the monarchy was a dynamic force.
I'm getting the impression that England was well governed and relatively advanced compared to its European counterparts.
Yes, that's quite correct. England then, like England today, was a much governed country. At the top, there was the king. In the period we're talking about, King John. Beneath him were a group of about 100 or so barons, the great landowners. Administratively, England was divided, as it is today, into shires or counties. The two words describe the same thing. The units of local government today, Warwickshire, Berkshire, Hampshire, were the units of government then. And the chief administrator, the chief official of the king in each county was the sheriff. And the sheriff, of course, was in charge of local tax collection. And that was why he was so bitterly unpopular. Think of the Sheriff of Nottingham in the Robin Hood legends. And the Robin Hood legends help us to understand one other thing, and that is that England was quite densely forested. Robin lived in Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire, and the forest, a third or a quarter of England was covered by the forest, had its own law, and the forest law was oppressive. If you were caught hunting the king's game, you would suffer imprisonment or mutilation or both. And that helps to explain why there are clauses in Magna Carta both limiting the forest boundaries and regulating the operation of the law within the forests.
Okay, well, should we walk over to where it's thought Magna Carta was actually granted?